Hey, I'm Jack. I'm a history teacher. I'm probably one of my last videos I'm going to do for a little while. Starting school soon, wrapping up. I'm not going to be able to read as much. Um, I don't know if this structure will be different. I am not going to be carving wood during this time, which I think the wood will thank me. But one of the things I wanted to talk a little about was one of my favorite pet subjects, probably my favorite pet subject, I think it's safe to say. I love ancient and medieval history. That's my kind of nest. But if we're getting really specific, I love those. I love the early medieval Britain and France. I love that period. I really am very engaged by it. I love it. I especially love Celtic history, but I also enjoy um, Anglo-Saxon, French, all those different things. Today, so where I left off where Britain kind of becomes its own thing. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple different things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how Britain changed in the decades, because it was decades, it was very quick, after the fall of the Roman Empire, and then what can be had about it. And then I'm going to talk a little about the Arthur myth, if there's an Arthur, if we can base it on anything, kind of have that conversation. Then I'm just going to go through like a bunch of books I love about the period and place that I have. I have a ton of books. I am looking at 17 right now that cover this topic, and I could have grabbed more. So I'm really excited to talk about it. We'll start off with, so in 410, the Roman government tells Britain to look to its own affairs. And the people living there at the time are often called Romano-Britons. They understood themselves as Romans of British extraction. That didn't mean they were necessarily Latin speakers first language, though many to most maybe were, particularly in the southeast. But it does mean that they thought of themselves that way. And we see that through even St. Patrick's writing. St. Patrick fundamentally understands himself as a Roman of British extraction. Even Gildas, who's writing much later, refers to our language when he talks about Latin. Our language. The barbarians do not speak our language. Now, at the same time, there seems to be incursions coming from both Ireland in the west, some Picts and other less Romanized Brittonic peoples in the north, and then the most famous, what we call the Anglo-Saxons, the early Germanic peoples appearing on their eastern shores. The Saxon shore, sometimes referred to. The Romans and early Britons called it the Saxon shore. Initially, many of these people were settled as foederati, these Germanic peoples. They were settled after serving in the Roman military, or for them. Bede tells us, and Gildas both reference a story of some lord or prince hiring them and then them kind of betraying them. Bede kind of has this. Bede does not like Britons. He does not like the people who are the ancestors of the modern day Welsh. He does not care for them. He finds them to be cowardly, distrustworthy, and the greatest sin of all, a bad Christian. So he refers to them as like these feckless cowards who like can't defend their own lands, and they hire the Germanic English, and the English, saying it the old way, the English eventually overthrow them because they're better, stronger, taller, more handsome, more blonde, more beautiful. The essence. And honestly, that idea is pretty pervasive. You can read, I'll show you books that kind of reference that, and they're written in the 90s, 2010s. I mean, that kind of convey that a little bit. And there's definitely something too that the Romano-Britons in the southeast particularly were much less militarized. They were more based on Roman societies that were less militarized. So they were less capable. So when new authority is being built up, they are not really necessarily resisting it. Or they move, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, and it's also part of the reason that in places like northwestern England or nearer Wales or Cornwall, there's a lot stiffer resistance. It's a lot less, the English show up and push aside the silly little Britons. It's like a lot more staunch resistance. Now, from this period, the legend of Arthur is begun to be rooted. Now, Gavin the Medievalist, who is a wonderful historian who does great YouTube works, talked extensively, far better than I'm going to today, about how far back we can trace the Arthurian myths. Now, Arthur is a Welsh name. It means something like son of the bear, of the bear. and he is most of his legends we know are from the High Middle Ages, the period from about the 12th to 15th century. People like Lancelot, they come later, but there is an older Arthur myth. We know it's old. We know at least Arthur existed in some capacity as a myth as early as the 10th century, and there's references that may be older. Now, who was Arthur, according to these very stripped back myths? People have tried to figure that out for a long time, which brings me actually to my first set of books. Leslie Alcock is a historian from the 70s. He's a good one. He argues that Arthur is a Britannic or Romano-Briton fighting back largely against the Saxons, that he was never a king, that he resisted it. This is mentioned in Gildas and things like that. So that's Leslie Alcock's Arthur's Britain. It is a little dated. Some of the information is no longer considered the best way of interpreting it, but that is great information you're going to get there. Now, one book that is by Guy Halsall, I'm less into this book, but there is some interesting thoughts in it, and he thinks a lot about how this might have looked. He talks about the worlds of Arthur. Now, he's a bit of a revisionist. He's thinking a lot about what does this mean? He's thinking a lot about like why was Leslie, basically like trying to prove John Morris and Leslie Alcock wrong. Probably in a way that's a little unfair, but one of the things he does make a good point of is that we're never really going to know who Arthur is. We're just not. I'm seeing if I can find the picture. We're never going to know who Arthur is. We will never really create this. There are references that are kind of old or new. There are references to him in Gildas and some early Welsh poetry, Y Godolphin, one of my favorite works. But we're never going to be able to probably recreate who this man might have been. That doesn't mean inherently that he didn't exist. I was looking for this picture. But it does mean that we don't have enough information to ever really know for sure. Now, this is a really cool depiction I like of how he may have looked. That Romano, you see a little bit of that Romano-Briton like armor and things like that. You can also see a little bit of the more traditional, like quote-unquote Welsh or Celtic things. Final book I'm going to show you about Arthur nonfiction is The First Kingdom by Max Adams. Now, I love Max Adams for the most part. I do think this might be his weakest book. I think he makes an argument that essentially the Anglo-Saxon migration was so small as to not really be meaningful, and I don't think there's any real evidence for that. I think that's a bit revisionist, and Max Adams is an incredibly talented Anglo-Saxonist. I would not say he dives deep into like Welsh history. Now, we're never going to know much about Arthur. But it's cool to see that the old legends from the Mabinogion, where Arthur's very different, he's a very different type of character, to references to him in Y Godolphin as this great leader. But let's stick to the ground that we know exists. Now, Britain becomes a place of small polities. Some of these are Britannic, whether Celtic-speaking or Latin, eventually all Celtic-speaking. Pictish in the north, which are, speaking a version of Britannic. English, I'm going to use English just as the term, because honestly, that's how many of them refer to themselves, though there were Saxons. That's where we get Sussex, Essex, Wessex. I believe I did that last time. And even a few Irish. Now, this is a great book if you like your archaeology. This is Robin Fleming's Britain After Rome. Robin Fleming's is awesome. It is all archaeology, so it makes it very dense. But I really recommend it if it's something you're interested in, if you're interested in things like hearing about what we can see, what we can do, things like that. That is one of our things. It tells us a lot about these societies. And she really looks at them writ large, which I really like. She doesn't really go like, these are the English ones and these are the Britannic ones. Because actually one of the points, especially early on, is that you can't really do that. Like, these people may have been Britannic speakers or English speakers, but those identities don't seem to calcify until later. Like as late as the 7th century, and we'll get to the 7th century in a minute, we see these elite groups have far more in common with each other and far more relation to each other than they do anyone else, than they do different. So that brings me to two things to talk about the elite warfare. First, Lords of Battles. Lords of Battles focuses on these. It talks about some of the different things, but basically talks about these warrior kings. And these guys are true blue warrior kings in the old way. These are old school warrior kings. They are rough dudes, thumb breakers who, for the most part, all die violently. They are not particularly pleasant guys, and they basically hire a bunch of meathead kids to help fight alongside them. They are rough dudes, but they are very interesting. And he talks about both the Anglo-Saxon and the Brittonic thing, and it creates some great poetry. We see Godolphin reference, we see some other poetry reference. I really enjoy this book. If you're interested in like the warrior aristocracies of early Britain, Lords of Battle by Stephen Evans, high recommend. Now, one thing I should have mentioned. I will be occasionally doing some historical fiction. I'm going to come back to that later, though. Now, let's move on to my specific Brittonic histories. The Brittonic histories are histories that speak specifically about the people who will become the Welsh. They talk about their authority, their things like that. This, again, is one of my favorite types of stories. The first, we have Men of the North by Tim Clarkson, excuse me. I have read several books by Tim Clarkson. He wrote a wonderful book on the Picts I highly recommend. He also wrote another book I will be referencing in a moment. But this talks about the people who existed, the Celtic-speaking Britons of Scotland. He is a early Scottish historian, but he really focuses on the Brittonic speakers in Scotland. Welsh speakers, or early Welsh speakers for our less knowledgeable listeners. Brittonic, by the way, is the early version of Welsh. It will become that, things like that. Highly recommend. Super tight read. Very interesting. If you're interested in Scottish history, if you're interested in Brittonic history, if you're interested in Celtic history, read Tim Clarkson. Now, here's another fun book. It's a little bit later, a little bit outside, but I wanted to shout out Tim Clarkson again. This is Strathclyde and the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Anglo-Saxons are the English. This is during the Viking Age. And Strathclyde is the one kingdom in Scotland that was Brittonic. It wasn't either Gaelic or Pictish or English. This was a different one. It survived in places like what is now, like Clydesdale, like where we get the horse Clydesdale, Cumberland, Cumbria, which you can even hear in the name a little bit. Cumbria is definitely tied to Cymraeg, which is the Brittonic and later Welsh word for their own ethnonym. An interesting thing to do is you can tell a lot about Celtic place names in Britain by what they're called. Now, if they are something like Walsingham, or Wallington, or something like that, a reference to Welsh, that was named by English people, usually an exonym. Not always, but usually an exonym. Now, if you are seeing something with Cumbria, Cymru, Cumberland, that might have been named by Welsh speakers themselves. Now, that leads us to Welsh Kings. Now, this is Welsh Kings by Ceri Mond. Ceri Mond covers a much wider thing, basically the independent Welsh, from the period of the fall of the Roman Empire to the death of Llewellyn the Last, in the 13th century, 1283, I believe, 13th century, at the hands of the Longshanks, who finally subdued the Welsh. It's a great book, more of a top-down history, less of a social history than Robin Fleming, Robin Fleming really focuses on common people in a way I really enjoy. But still interesting if you're interested in Welsh history at large. Now, we're going to move on to the 7th century. I have a ton of books on Anglo-Saxons. There's Anglo-Saxons by Mark Morris. I like that book a lot. There's plenty of books like Word Horde or Ways of Winter, which are great about Anglo-Saxon language, understandings of the world. I'm actually going to talk about Max Adams' book, King of the North. This, I think, is his magnum opus, his greatest work. It is about a guy named King Oswald. King Oswald is the king of Northumbria, the most far north English kingdom from the period of 634 to 642. I believe I have those years exactly right. He is one of these warrior kings. Who's live fast, die hard. But he's one of the first Christian ones who was raised as a Christian, particularly in the North. His predecessor, Edwin I, had converted, but even Bede believes Edwin did it for political reasons, which he certainly did. He wanted to get good trade out of the continental drift. But Oswald gives you a really good window into this. He is the influence for a lot of really interesting works, actually. Aragorn, in one of his letters, Tolkien says that one of the influences for Aragorn is King Oswald of Northumbria, because King Oswald flees Northumbria when he's a child. When Edwin takes over and his father Aethelfrith dies, he flees to an Irish monastery in Iona, where he's educated as a Christian, educated in these monasteries, trained to be a war leader. His brother dies; he does not. He comes south after Edwin is killed by Penda, the pagan king of Mercia, and Cathwallan, the king of Gwynedd, the Welsh king of Gwynedd. This is when we start seeing that crystallization a little bit, that like ethnic me versus you-ness to it. And Cathwallan proceeds to just harry Northumbria for 2 years. Now Bede always writes, this is often taken at face value, that he was just like a madman who was destroying everything. More likely what he seemed to be trying to doing was breaking up the institutional power of the English. He was trying to break the power of the Northern English, because he seems to be focusing on fortresses, on hams, on Yevering. He goes to these places. Now, King of the North by Max Adams. High recommend. One of his great works. Now, some Britons fled or left for another opportunity. Some were hired by the Romans, and some went other places. Now, one of our most famous are the Bretons of modern-day Brittany. Brittany in France, which is the Northwest Peninsula. Historically, parts of it spoke a language that was closely related to Cornish and Welsh. Those people have a lot of Celtic understandings. If you go to some towns in Brittany today, you'll see bilingual signs, both in French and Breton. Some people do still speak Breton. It is definitely a dying language, because mostly the elderly really speak it. I remember when I went to Quimper, I spoke to a guy, and he's like, I know Breton speakers. They're mostly older, and they're mostly in the villages. He's like, there's not that many left. About 80,000, I believe, is the final count. But it is really interesting. And a really cool history, and one that I've written a book about, that I'm currently working on, and that I love learning about. There's such an interesting little microculture that really stays independent in France for a long time. I mean, as late as the 1600s, they have rules that they are not going to fight unless the English are invading. Now, if you want to learn about the Bretons, there's a lot of fun things you can do. One, you do Brittany and the Carolingians. This is as the Bretons coalesced right before the Viking Age, and their administration by the Carolingians, Charlemagne and his descendants. Province and Empire of Brittany and the Carolingians. That's Julia M. Smith. Now, a little later, you get to Brittany and the Angevins, essentially its spiritual successor. Brittany and the Angevins is by J.A. Everard. It is 1158, 1203. Really interesting. Those are more top-up things, so there is a social history element. But if you are interested in a social history of Brittany, and honestly gives you a good window into the social history of Wales during this time, this is the early medieval period, I recommend Small Worlds by Wendy Davies. Small Worlds by Wendy Davies is the village community in the early medieval Britain. This is a focus on the roles and charters of Redon. Redon is in southeast Brittany. I think I passed through it on a train once. It's really cool. Really gets into who these people were and how they thought about the world. These sort of mix of French and Celtic influence, how they're kind of all their own thing. It's really interesting. Okay, I'm running low on time, so I got to get to the end of this. First, fiction recommendations. If you want to read a historical retelling of King Arthur, or if King Arthur was real, this is what he would have been like, high recommend. 2, Bernard Cornwell's The Winter King, Book 1. That is a focus on Arthur's early years. Book 2, Enemy of God, a lot about the church and religion during that time. Finally, Excalibur. It takes liberties, but it is an incredibly fun book. It is very immersive and hugely influenced by Leslie Alcock's Arthur's Britain. Now, one of the best depictions and understandings of early medieval history I have ever seen in a work is by Nicola Griffith. That is Hild. Hild is set during the 7th century, right around the same time that Oswald exists. There are 2 books. There is Hild, I recommend, and Manwood. Manwood is her sequel. They are both incredible. She is a wonderful author. She is incredibly well-researched. You can tell she is sitting there reading Bede as she is doing this research. She is one of my favorite authors. She also wrote a wonderful mythological story about Arthur called Spear. Highly recommend that as well if you're interested. And she writes stories really well with very immersive characters that both appeal to modern audiences. I mean, you have like characters of color, you have queer characters, things like that, but she really contextualizes them in a really good way of like, how would this person understand themselves in the 7th century? I highly recommend her books. Now, this has gone quite long. I didn't mean it to, but I really enjoy talking about it. I have so many books about these, and I really enjoy sharing them. I hope I can redo another video. I might do something different. I might do Bronze Age, honestly, like kind of shift gears. I feel like I've been talking a lot about Rome, and I could definitely break it up a little bit. But for all, that's it for now. And yeah.